we'll get going here. So last week was kind of quite interesting. We had just share with you briefly. We had technical challenges. I tried to start that YouTube stream going, and everything at my end told me it was going, but it wasn't. And I finally figured out after everything was over that a setting had changed. I didn't change it, but it had changed. And it changed our stream from public to private, and that's been fixed. Then I went to take down my audio equipment, and the low battery light came on. So even though the talk was going up to YouTube, and I could have recovered it later, the audio board shut itself off, and we had no audio after about halfway through the talk. So I got that taken care of. Got the batteries all changed out, and I had to put the talk backed up from the mini DV tape in the camcorder. And while I'm pulling up my cables, I run cables from the camera back to the computer. It looked like one of the cables was moving, and somehow a little black garter snake had gotten in the house and was crawling around. So we had quite an eventful Sunday last Sunday. So hopefully we'll have less excitement this week. All right, we're going to continue with part two. Part two of I Don't Know. This might be 2 of 2, or might be 2 of I Don't Know. Because the topics that we're talking about are so deep, and each one could go on for eternity, I guess. We could constantly be expanding our concept of God. We will be forever and ever. But last week I introduced you reintroduced you to one of my favorite authors, Emmett Fox. I'm holding up for folks on YouTube a little booklet called The 7 Main Aspects of God. That's kind of where the ideas we're talking about today come from. And I mentioned that it's good for us to go out and explore different teachers and different ideas and kind of read things and mull them over and see how other people look at things. And we want to do this in the spirit of commonality. In the opening quote Wendy gave us from J.K. Rowling said, we're as strong as we are united. That's as strong as we are. And the intellect likes to divide things. If you kind of consider that, the intellect looks at something and tries to name it and tries to put it into a pigeonhole, and in so doing, it separates whatever it is from everything else. Excuse me. And we have to keep in mind that when we look at something and we do that, we're not seeing it as it is. We are seeing it as we think it is. We're putting it into the pigeonhole we think it belongs in. And it may not belong in that pigeonhole at all. we may have made a filing error, but nevertheless we will go through life believing that where we filed it, that's what it is. That's what it is. For example, we take a bite of food, a dish that perhaps we've never eaten before. We take a bite of food and it tastes terrible. So we kind of take that and file it into the things that taste terrible folder that's open on the desktop of our mind. And then we find out years later that dish tastes good, but that particular instance of the dish that we had wasn't. There was something wrong with it. Maybe some of the food had spoiled. Maybe the chef misread the recipe. Who knows? But my point is that we had labeled everything about that dish as being terrible, when in fact it wasn't. This was a false impression that we have created and we have filed away. So we're constantly need to be going back and updating our ideas. We constantly need to be going back and saying, these things that we have. Something just happened here. What was that? Those who are watching on YouTube, sorry about that. I was on the bridge, sorry about that. I'm going to try to edit all that out later. The camera just quit on me in the middle of this. All right, so I was just basically saying that we're looking at other teachers. We're looking at Emmett Fox because it's important for us to update our ideas about things, particularly our ideas about God. If we consider what life is made of, and we consider what we're talking about from spiritual growth, it is done unto us according to our belief. So we take that as an operating principle. It's done unto you according to your belief. So if it's done unto you according to your belief, then updating your beliefs, if you want to consider it that way, or being sure of what you believe, looking at other ways of believing, thinking critically and asking yourself, well, how do I know what I know? How does this relate to something I already know, or is it so new and so different that I need to toss out everything I already believed? And our spiritual growth is constantly discovering more of what God is. That's what we're doing. We're constantly discovering more of what God is, but more of what God is right where we are, in us, as us, and through us. So reading other authors, listening to talks by Emmett Fox. Some of his talks are still available, I believe, on YouTube. This morning I found some of Dr. Holmes' radio's programs are available on YouTube. All of these things that we do are ways of shaking loose old ideas, shaking loose old incorrect ideas that we may have about God and about the way God works and who we are in relation to God and all of those kind of things. All of that serves to help our spiritual growth. We have to be willing to do that. So this is what we've been talking about the last couple of weeks, is how should we think about God? How should we think about God? The word itself is, it means so many things to so many people. If I stood in a room of 100 people and used that word, there'd be 110 different understandings of what I just said. So we use words in our culture. We use words and we assume that everybody else has the same understanding as we do, and they don't. They don't, and that's why in one of the things that you learn in communication skills is to ask for clarification. So somebody says something, and you got to say, well, what do you mean by that? What is your understanding of that word? What is your definition of that word? Because it may not be my understanding or my definition. Emmett Fox, in one of his little booklets, he said, if you find somebody who tells you they don't believe in God, ask them what kind of God they don't believe in, because very likely you don't believe in that kind of a God either. But people do that, and they do that with the word prayer. It's another word. So sometimes people will toss out things about prayer, and everybody assumes, a prayer is a prayer is a prayer. And it's not. It's not. Cherry Parker and Elaine St. John's wrote a book back in the 50s, I believe, Prayer Can Change Your Life. And it wasn't a very scientific study in terms of, they weren't scientists. I think Parker was a professor of psychology at a university, later became a minister. But they kind of looked at this concept of, can prayer heal? Which now, if you go to Institute of Noetic Sciences, IONS, and if you look at their work, they've got it in a more, especially Dr. Dean Radin's work, they have it in a more scientific fashion in terms of statistics and probable standard deviations and all of these things that I absolutely don't understand. But Cherry Parker and Elaine St. John's came to the conclusion that prayer does make a difference, but it depends on the belief system of the one praying and the belief system of the one prayed for. In other words, some prayers were effective and some prayers were not effective, and some prayers may in fact have been effective in the wrong way. So this is why Emmett Fox uses the term scientific prayer. Are we praying in a way that will be effective? Are we praying in a way that's repeatable? Are we praying in a way that's sustainable, and we can see the results, and we can kind of change our procedure or modify our procedures as we go along? And what he tells us then is that in his definition, prayer is thinking about God, and scientific prayer is thinking about a problem in terms of an aspect of God. So we need to understand how to think about God, because if we're going to look at a problem, or as I said last week, we're going to look at an opportunity, and if we want to address this issue with prayer, if we want to address this issue by thinking about God, then what kind of God are we thinking about? See, and how are we thinking about God? Now remember, as a small child in catechism class, we were taught from the Baltimore Catechism, And we were taught by rote. We were given a question and we were given an answer, and we were supposed to memorize the answer to the question. And that's kind of the way school worked. And one of the questions was, well, why did God make me? Why did God make me? And I remember the answer, and I can almost hear the voices of little school children around me as we repeated in unison. We repeated in rote, and of course it was in sexist language in the terms of God as a hymn. And it said, God made me to know him, to love him, to serve him, and to be happy with him in heaven. That was the response that we were taught. And if I think about it today, it's a beautiful response. But my understanding of what God is, my understanding of what love is, my understanding of what service is, my understanding of what happiness is, and my understanding of what heaven is have all grown. They have all just expanded from that time. So as a little 5 or 6 year old kid in the first grade, learning this and repeating this, and now as an adult, it has a totally different meaning for me, a totally different understanding for me, yet it is still true. It is still simple. It is still beautiful. So that's what we're talking about here, is how do you think about God? How do you think about prayer? How do you think about the effectiveness of prayer? And these are the things that Emmett Fox is asking us to consider in this little booklet. Now, Dr. Holmes tells us that all thought is causative, if you will. It's done unto us according to our belief. And we believe lots of things that we know consciously, lots of things that we know below our level of consciousness or subliminally. And we believe lots of things that just in fact aren't true. And whatever this power that answers prayer, the power that responds to us according to our belief, it acts upon all that. It doesn't discriminate. It acts as a law or a principle. So you think gravity doesn't discriminate. Anything that has mass is affected by gravity. Saints, sinners, everybody is affected by gravity. So if we think of this power that responds to us according to our belief in the same manner, then the question becomes, what am I believing? What do I believe? What is happening in my life, and what are my beliefs? And what Dr. Holmes tells us is that all thought is to some degree powerful. But trained thought is more powerful. Trained thought is more powerful than untrained thought. Excuse me when I get a drink of water. And you can kind of think of anything that we do, and if we practice it and if we have a discipline about practicing it, we get better and better at it. Right? So if you want to exercise and if you want to run a marathon, you go out and you learn the techniques of running, but you practice running. You get out and you run. And through this practice of running, you get better at running. You get stronger at running. Your wind develops. Your cardiovascular system develops. And you get stronger at it. If you want to learn how to play the piano, you get a keyboard and you start taking lessons. But you have to practice every day, you see. So you could say, anybody who puts their finger on the keyboard of a piano can make a note. Because they're not doing it. The piano is making the note, but they are depressing the key. Anybody can go over to a piano and start tapping on the keys, and sound will come out. But those who have trained, those who have practiced, right? Well, they're gonna give us something that's probably a little bit more pleasing, something that we recognize as a tune. So we want to consider then our spiritual growth. We want to consider what this is that we're doing here on this planet as spiritual beings having a human experience. And we are expressing the divine life, and we are constantly learning more of what that is, more of what that means. As Paul said, who am I that God is mindful of me? Or as the Baltimore Catechism says, we want to know God. We want to know God. So what is this God? What is this idea of God that we want to know. And the reason that it's important for us to know it is that our opinions of God constitute our religion. Our opinions of God, they lay the foundation for our life. So if we believe that God is a mean, punishing, vindictive God, we will have a life that reflects that. If we believe that God is a kind and loving and generous God, we will have a life that reflects that, you see, because it is done unto us according to our belief. And many of the ideas that we inherited in our culture about God are of an anthropomorphic God who is just like a big man in the sky, kind of like I call it the Santa Claus God. Looks down from heaven, decides who's doing good, who's not doing good, keeping track in a big ledger somewhere. And instead of getting coal in your stocking on Christmas Day, why will you get to suffer forever if you have too many negative strikes in your book? That's the image that we have grown up with. And now what we want to do is we want to look at that and say, well, is that the only way of thinking of God? So Emmett Fox tells us, we can't kind of get our mind around God all at once. He uses the example of going to the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. It's a huge building. You can't see it all at once. You have to see it little by little. You have to go through the halls and you have to see this room and then that room and then another room, and you go up a floor and down a floor and those kind of things. And when we consider God, what this thing called God is everything, but we can't get our mind around everything. We have to take it little bits at a time. Now we understand that the little bit that we're looking at is not the entire whole, but it's a little bit that we can get our mind around, a little bit that we can understand, a little bit that we can contemplate or think about. And this is what he's telling us to do. He says, start with 7 main aspects of God and think about them on a regular basis. He says, if you're a fast thinker, you might think about them all twice a day. If you're a slow thinker, you might think about them once a day. And I chuckled to myself and I said, man, if you're a preacher, you might think about them one a day for a week. How much time do we put thinking about these things? How much time do we spend with what is literally the most important thing in our life, is our concept of God, because out of it comes everything else. So Fox tells us to just kind of take these things, not only to think about them just for the pure education and growth, of thinking about them, but also to apply to some particular issue in our life. Now, I worked for many years in an organization where I interfaced with the research and design group, and my department's job was to come up with new ideas and then get the designers to design them and then bring these ideas to market. That's what we did, product development. Now, in the research and design community, we had 2 groups. We had a base research group, and then we had people who actually applied the base research. So the guys who did the base research and the ladies who did the base research, they were paid to play. They were given a bucket of money, and they would go into the labs and they would work on whatever they wanted to work on, and they would patent it. And they were developing intellectual property for the company. Now, in some cases, they would develop something and people would look at that and say, oh, what are we going to do with that? What is that all about? And it wouldn't be for years before somebody would say, hey, I think if we took that thing that was developed years ago, I think we could turn it into a marketable product. So that's kind of base research, is just for the sake of learning. And then you have applied science, which was what Edison was. Edison took things that other people had been working on and said, how can I sell this? How can I make it work? In fact, there's a couple stories about Edison to kind of show his mindset. Was he invented the Nickelodeon, which was a device that you looked into. It had like binocular things that you looked into, If you've ever been to a penny arcade, you've seen them. It had a handle on the side. You turned it, and there was little cards in there, and each card had a still picture on it, and the pictures had been taken just, a fraction of a second after one another. And when you turn the handle, they would flip, and they move fast enough, and it looked like a moving picture. Those were the first moving pictures here that Edison had developed. And of course, the Luminary brothers in France, they were working on projection. They were working on projecting things on a wall. But Edison said he couldn't imagine a group of strangers paying money to go sit in a room together in the dark to see a moving picture. So he felt that the individualized experience, or the individual experience of Nickelodeon, that was the way to go. He didn't see the value in it. He wasn't trying to work with motion pictures just for the sake of, hey, isn't this cool? Let's see what we can do. He had the target market in mind. He had the idea in mind that people were going to go somewhere and put their head against this machine and turn this handle. And because he was only looking at some specific problem, he missed kind of a bigger picture. Same thing with airplanes. He heard the story is that he was told about the Wright brothers experiments, and he said he couldn't possibly believe that people were going to go tearing up farmland all across the country to put in airports to make air travel viable. Well, you see where we are today. So the same thing in our religious or spiritual growth, right? As Holmes would tell us, our religion is our opinion of God. That's what I mean by religion. And spiritual is, to me, different than religion. So religion is about dogma and creed and understanding, and I believe this and I believe that, I believe the other thing. Spirit is I experience it. I experience the love of God, see. So religion might tell us that God is love, but spirituality is when we experience the love of God, when we experience ourselves as the love of God in action. That's the difference. That's the difference. So part of our growth is just like that base research. Part of our growth is just reading other books, reading other ideas, exposing ourselves to the ideas from the East, from the West, from the major religions of the world, from the major philosophies of the world. Just for the sake of seeing how other people think, just for the sake of looking at where the commonality is. I love it. I love it. We read some of the things from Black Elk, and we read some of the things, the Discourse of Chief Seattle, that allegedly these books contain ideas from Native American spiritual leaders. They may or may not. I don't know, because we don't know how well those authors spoke those native languages. We don't know how well those native speakers spoke English. But nevertheless, we can read the ideas. We can read the ideas. How can you sell the land? How can you sell the air? How can you sell the water? It belongs to everyone. It belongs to our children. And we recognize the beauty in these ideas. I love reading Rumi, the Sufi mystic from around 1300 in Afghanistan. Beyond ideas of right doing and wrong doing, there's a field. I will meet you there. See? Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that beautiful? Doesn't that speak to us? Don't we get that? And yet, totally different time, totally different culture, totally different religion. But we get it. See, we get it. When we look for the commonality, we get it. So Emmett Fox is telling us then, in order for us to take on in earnest and begin our journey, which is a journey that never ends, we want to take aspects of God, because we can't get our mind around all of God at once. So we want to take aspects of God, recognizing that God is not the aspect, right? The aspect is simply a handle that we put onto our understanding. It's, if you've ever seen the glaziers carrying a big painted down the sidewalk, they've got these little suction cup handles that they stick onto the glass so they can get a hold of it and they can move it, because otherwise they couldn't get a handle on it. So I want you to think of these aspects of God as a handle. This is a handle that we're putting on a concept that is just too abstract for us to understand. Now, one way to think about these things is just for the pure sake of thinking about them, in our daily times of being alone, or in our daily times of contemplation, in our daily times of prayer. Just think about these things. And another way is if there is a specific issue or issues in our life or in the lives of our loved ones where somebody has asked us to pray for them. And by the way, I just want to clarify, I would not pray for people or treat for people, as we call it, without their permission, because two reasons. One is I would not want to intrude on their life. If I was a medical doctor, I wouldn't go give somebody a shot just because I thought they needed it. If you believe prayer is effective, you would not want to impose your belief on somebody else without their permission. The other thing is they've got a part in the process. They have to be open and receptive and willing. So asking them, people will say, would you pray for me? You say, well, sure, but what is it that you want? And they would say, for example, health, and say, well, are you willing to accept it? And they say, sure. Then are you willing to let go of everything in your life that you ought to let go of in order for this demonstration of health to come through you? See? There has to be a willingness to let go. So if we are working to use scientific prayer or effective prayer, as Fox would call it, for some specific issue, we want to think about the corresponding aspect of God. We'll get our results quicker, better, if we think of the corresponding results. So we're going to get to life, and this may be the only principle we get to today, the only aspect we get to today, but that's fine, because this is not only an effort of a lifetime, this is for eternity. You and I are constantly going to be updating our concepts of God. So Emmett Fox asks us to consider that the first thing we know about God, or the first thing we want to consider about God, is that God is life itself. Not just alive, not just living, not a creature who is living and moving and eating and all the other things that biologists tell us that constitute life. I can't remember what they are. It was 4 definitions: respiration, assimilation, elimination, and maybe movement. I don't know. But God is not just those things. God is life itself. Life, as according to Emmett Fox, is being or existence. And again, these are kind of an abstract idea to us. What is being? What does that mean? Existence. What does existence mean? And it causes us to stop and go back and think about, well, wait a second now, As a kid, I had this Santa Claus idea of God as a man with a big long white beard sitting on a throne in the sky looking down on. And now, God is life itself. But which life is it? See, we look out the window, or I look out my window here, and my yard is abundant with life, different expressions of life, you see. There are trees, there are hedges, there are birds, there are squirrels, there are rabbits. Last week there was a snake. There are all different expressions of life. So now do we go in and say this thing that we want to think of as God? Well, it's alive in me but not in the bird, or it's alive in me but not in the tree. And we have to come and think that God is life itself. Life itself. Being, existence. It is. It just is. And now when we start to explore the ideas of the great thinkers of great times, if we start to explore the ideas of the scriptures of different world religions, we can start to see this idea of isness, suchness, and I amness. I amness. So in the Hebrew tradition, Moses goes up the mount and is in the very presence of the divine, right? The bush is burning, but it's not consumed. Now, in that culture, that is a metaphor for a deep meditative experience. It's very important to consider, where are we going to find God? Where are we going to meet God? Not out there, not out there. Because everything you and I experience, we experience in our consciousness, in our awareness. Excuse me, even if we touch a hot stove, which I don't want you to do. Don't try this at home. Even if we touch a hot stove, where do we experience that? We experience that in our consciousness. Yes, we feel that our fingers hurt, but what tells us they're hurting is our consciousness. So as we wish to grow and learn and experience more of God, where are we going to do that? We're going to do that within our consciousness. See? So now we recognize Moses was having this deep experience of consciousness. He experienced the very presence of God, the very life that there is. Not just some life, but all of life. All of life. In the Wednesday night group, we're looking at mystical experiences, experiences of cosmic consciousness. And this sense of unity, this sense of oneness with all of life, you see, this is something that the mystics of different times and different cultures and different places report experiencing in your experience. One with everything. Kind of like the joke about the Zen pizza, one with everything. We at times we get these glimpses and we experience what Moses experienced, or what we believe Moses might have experienced. This unity with all things. And he says to God, he says, who should I tell when I go back down the mountain? Who should I tell the people down there gave me these commandments, you know? And the voice says, I am. I am that I am. I am. See, that which is one, that which is not divided or separated as our intellect would do. Our intellect would say, I am Jim and you are not. The divine can only say, I am, because it is alive as everything. It is life as everything. In Buddhism, we're given the idea of the isness, the isness of life, the suchness of life. Life is, you know. And we can sit around all day long. We can sit around forever saying, why? Why is life? And there is no why. There is no answer. It just is. It just is. So the very first aspect we want to think of God is that God is life. It is the life in the tree. It is the life in the rabbit. It is the life in you and I. It is all life. It is expressing itself as all life and through all life. And it knows exactly what to do. That life knows how to express itself. You know, you'll hear me talk of Dr. Bale's description in his book, Your Mind Can Heal You, of the process by which a human being, and not just a human being, but which many creatures go through just to be born, you know. You have a sperm and an egg, and they split in half, and then they combine together to make a completely new cell with a completely new DNA structure. And then that cell splits and becomes 2, and then they 4, and then 8, and 16, and so on. And some become eyes, and some become ears, and some become bones. What is it that knows how to do that? What is it that is expressing itself through that? What is it that takes the dust of the earth and forms it into a human body? But it is the very compulsion of life itself. It is life itself expressing itself. Excuse me. So we want to start our journey then. We want to start our journey of thinking about the aspects of God with life itself. God is. God is being. God is existence. But it is not just some, it is all. And existence is not something that it does, it is something that it is. It is. It is its very nature. Very nature. The other thing we were taught in catechism was that God had created us in its image and likeness. And what does that mean, image and likeness? Does that mean God has a face like ours and fingers like ours? Or does it mean the nature, the essence, the isness, the suchness, the existence? So this isness, this life itself, it was never born, it shall never die, you see. It just is. It is the I amness. It knows exactly how to express itself in any set of circumstances, in any conditions. I love, a couple of weeks ago, there was an article on the internet that scientists have discovered a life form on Earth that does not use oxygen. You remember bazillions of years ago, oxygen wasn't that prevalent on this planet. Something happened and suddenly oxygen started to appear, and life forms that could use the oxygen also appeared. So we have lungs, and we have cardiovascular systems. We have trees to exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen with. Life itself expressed perfectly for those circumstances. But in other circumstances, such as way down at the bottom of the ocean by the volcanic vents, there's life forms that don't need oxygen. There's life forms that can breathe in the sulfur. What is this magnificent thing called life that is expressing itself so perfectly? So at one level, it's just to stop and think about that. Just stop and think about that. It opens us up. It opens up our hearts. It opens up our souls. It opens us up. Go out and smell the roses. Don't analyze the fragrance. Get down on your hands and knees and look at a blade of grass. Maybe pick one up and hold it to the sunlight and see how beautiful it is. Contemplate the magnificence of what life is and how life knows what to do. And it is constantly expressing itself perfectly. So that's kind of like the base research, right? That's just kind of like, oh my goodness, I'm part of that. See, that's the other thing, is I'm part of that. I'm not on the outside looking in. I'm part of that. I'm included in that. And then when we come to any particular area of our life where that seems to be restricted, for example, sickness, disease, lack of ambition, Emmett Fox tells us, lack of energy, lack of joy. He says joy is a great expression of life. Joy is a combination of life and love. Excuse me. And in biblical terms, we are told that the children of God shout out in joy. Shout out in joy. When we recognize that we are part of this thing called life, that we too are never born, we too shall never die, that life as us it's going to know, and it does know how to express itself perfectly no matter what the circumstances, we are joyful. So if we're lacking joy in our life, we're lacking love and we're lacking life. If we don't have ambition or enthusiasm, excitement about the day, my goodness, what a beautiful day. Then we can bring ourselves to think about God as life. We think of disease, if someone has disease, and we have to consider that this power of life that knew how to take the dust of the earth and create a human body must certainly know how to produce perfect health. So we think about God as health. We think about God as life. This is important, and I'm going to close with this because the time got skewed with the tape running out. But I'll close with this today because it's kind of a good place to stop. If we wish to turn away from our problems and turn towards God, which is what Fox is telling us, right? This is a scientific prayer. We turn away from our problems, we turn to God by thinking about the aspect of God that is the opposite of our problem, because the divine doesn't have problems. Only opportunities. The divine doesn't have problems. But if we are to pray and to pray effectively and to experience the answer that we want for our prayer, we must pray in a language, for lack of a better way to put it, we must pray in a language that the divine understands. And here's what I mean by that. The divine doesn't know anything about the disease. It is life expressing itself perfectly. So if we try to think in terms of disease, remove this disease, you see the billboards, fight this, help fight this disease. If we're putting all of our attention and energy into the disease, we are believing in the disease. Right? We are believing in the power of the disease. And what we want to do is bring ourselves back to believe in God. God is life. Life knows how to express itself perfectly. Life created these bodies and knows every cell, every organ, every tissue intimately. And it knows exactly how to express itself in perfect health. So we want to think in terms of God, of an aspect of God. So if it is a sickness or a disease that we are working to eliminate, what we are doing is eliminating the belief in the sickness or the disease, and we are replacing it with a belief in life, in a belief in love, in a belief in the power of God. If it is a lack of ambition, if we're feeling down or depressed or all these kind of things, we don't want to speak in those terms. Because the divine doesn't have any experience with that. So here's the example I use. You have a dimmer switch on your dining room lights. Most of us do, right? And you go over to that dimmer switch and you turn the dining room light on. You can turn it on very brightly or you can turn it on very soft. It makes no difference to the nuclear plant up the road. None whatsoever. It doesn't know. It doesn't know that the light is on brightly or the light is on softly. It just knows it's expressing itself as electricity. So rather than thinking that the divine is expressing itself as sickness or disease, just come to think in terms of somehow the human belief system is interfering with that perfect expression of life. And what we are doing is we are dissolving those erroneous beliefs by bringing our attention to the aspect of God as life. Using light as an example, it makes no difference how long the room has been dark. It makes no difference who turned out the lights and pulled the curtains. If you walk into that room and you wish to experience the light, you do what is required by turning on the light switch. The instant the light comes on, the darkness disappears. It doesn't moan, it doesn't groan, it doesn't fight, it doesn't struggle. You can't hear it scurrying towards the door. It disappears because it was a condition. It was not a reality. It had no power to sustain itself. So we want to think then, if we are working for the demonstration of health, we want to think in terms of the sickness or the disease is a condition. It is there. We experience it just like we experience the darkness. But now we're going to turn on the light of truth. We're going to turn on the light of love. We are going to turn on the light of life. So we want to bring our minds, train thought. We're going to practice by bringing ourselves to think about the aspect of God as life. And I invite you this week, take time every day. Take time to celebrate life. Take time to think about what life is. Take time to catch it in expression everywhere. What is your favorite expression of life? And I'm smiling because I know that most people are going to say it's their pet. You know, it's just joyful all the time. It's enthusiastic all the time. It just wants to be held. It wants to play. It's just alive. It's just alive. So find whatever it is in your life that helps you to experience life itself. And next week we'll pick up where we left off. We'll talk some more about life, and then we'll talk about the others of the 7 main aspects of God. Have a beautiful week, everyone. And so it is.